Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. I've not been able to say happy Friday on a webinar for a long time, but welcome to our sustainability webinar this morning with the wonderful Adam Bastock from Small 99, who will be talking to us this morning about how to measure for success, which is becoming ever more important within business. So we want to give you all the tips, tricks that you need to make it a success within your business. Before we get going, just a few things. As always, this webinar is being recorded, so please don't worry if you miss anything or if you have to dip out or whatever, that's fine. Obviously, we're recording it for you and we will be sending it in a replay to you probably on Monday, if that's okay. And just as a reminder, we do have the chat, so please do ask questions in the chat, but also use the Q&A if you'd like to as well. We'll be doing a Q&A at the end. And as always, we like to challenge Adam with difficult questions.
Yes, please do.
Adam hates it when I say that, but well, no, he might love it.
I resign myself to it at this point. I've just,
Yes.
yeah.
We have resigned to asking Adam difficult questions, answering all your difficult questions. Please do start introducing yourself in the chat. It's great to know who's here and who's joining us this Friday morning. And well done for joining us on a Friday to come and do some sustainability training. We love to see the commitment from you guys. And just a massive thank you, obviously, to BT who support us on this webinar program. Please do check everything that they do for small businesses. Check them out on their website. Adam, over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, so hello everybody. I'm feeling like it's going to be quite a nice, relaxed wander through measurement this morning. So yeah, nice to be doing a Friday webinar. Today we're going to be talking about measurement, carbon footprinting, and really how to kind of get an idea of your environmental impact, but from a more technical point of view. So this is going to be potentially one for some of the more nerdy sort of data number orientated people out there. Apologies if that isn't your scene, but we'll hopefully be able to answer any questions you've got around measurement as we go through this. So, as mentioned, please do put any comments in the chat as we go. I've got it open, so I will try and kind of answer those either at the end or if I think it's relevant, I'll dive into it as we go. What I want to do this morning is just before we get too stuck into the actual how to measure your carbon footprint, I wanted to take a step back and look at the slightly bigger picture and go, well, why do you want to measure? What's that going to look like? So really answering the question of what is net zero in the first place and just putting in place some what's the word? Solid foundations so that we know that everyone's on the same page. In terms of net zero, there's also a term called carbon neutral, which has been around quite a while. Some of you may have heard of this or may have seen me do similar webinars to this before around clarifying the two. It's really important to remember the key differences, though, because it is quite a big kind of difference and a big challenge. So with carbon neutrality, the idea is that you're essentially relying on carbon offsets or carbon credits in order to neutralize your carbon impact. And therefore, if you've got a carbon footprint of around 100 tons, you would then buy equal to that footprint 100 tons of credits. Now, as a small business, it's unlikely your footprint's that large, but I'm just using these numbers as a bit of it's an easy number to work with. If you've got that 100 tons of a carbon footprint, you buy 100 tons of credits, that neutralizes your impact. The important thing with carbon neutrality is sometimes it does only include carbon dioxide and may ignore some of the other carbon emissions or greenhouse gases, sorry, like methane. So if you're in agriculture, methane is quite a big part of your footprint. The main thing with carbon neutrality is that it does not need any reduction. It is about neutralizing and neutralizing your impact. It doesn't necessarily need that much action. And therefore it is, and I don't think this is a bad thing necessarily, it is essentially throwing money at the problem where you're just going, actually, let's just do as much as we can to try and get rid of our footprint and to neutralize it through a certified kind of process, but it's not necessarily requiring you to change your business operations that much. It's for that reason this is increasingly under scrutiny. I would emphasize that the issue is not really in small businesses doing this. It is more large companies who may be resting on their laurels a little bit and having that kind of carbon neutral status, but then not actually changing their operations. Thinking of something like the bigger corporates out there or something like the, kind of a few £1 million of turnover companies that could be doing more than they actually are. We're seeing this in 2026, where the EU is starting to ban these environmental claims. So there's a great article in The Guardian that kind of outlined this around phrases being used like climate positive, carbon neutral, environmentally friendly, natural, biodegradable, climate neutral, eco-friendly. these are all going to need to be substantiated and quite like quantified if you are using them, purely because there's too many companies out there that are using these terms and not necessarily actually, backing that up with data or evidence. So this is where the carbon neutrality is starting to wane slightly, is because it is going to need a lot more verification if people are using this term. Which brings us on to net zero. And net zero really is about that reduction action. So if you've got 100 tons of emissions, it will then be that you need to reduce your footprint down by 90% by 2050 or 2045, depending on where you are. Different kind of regions have got different targets, but let's call it 2050 for ease. So if you've got 100 tons, you would need to have a 10-ton footprint in 2050 and reducing that down in the near term, which is the more important one, by 50% by 2030. So 2030 is now what? Basically 5 years away. So you need to reduce your footprint by 50% in the next 5 years. That sounds really scary. It's actually not that impossible. Putting in solar panels, LED lighting, electric vehicles, electric bikes, these all reduce your footprint down by quite considerable chunks. So this really is where that 50% by 2030, 90% by 2050 is key, and only 10% of that can be used in terms of carbon offsets. And therefore, you need to really demonstrate your reduction before you start relying on carbon offsets at the end of it. Just to set the scene of like what is affecting larger companies, and I'm thinking more if you are a business to business company here, or you're thinking of supplying into larger companies, it's really useful to understand the context. The NHS is a great example where if you look at their timelines, they've got quite a clear definition of their kind of carbon footprint and carbon reduction journey. And the reason why I'm using the NHS is just because they're a really big corporate body that's got the most public information available on this. Where if you look at like 2023 or 2022, sorry, 2 years ago, all NHS tenders had a 10% net zero rating, where you had to commit to net zero and that would get you 10% points on any tenders you're going for. 2023, that became slightly more a requirement for larger contracts. 2024, so like 6 months ago, they introduced a requirement on net zero, a net zero commitment. 2027, we're going to start needing reporting across all areas of the business, across all parts of the footprint as of 3 years' time. And then we start to see those restrictions coming in from 2030. So quite a rapid change here in what some of the big corporates are doing around carbon footprint requirements, and therefore that might actually help you get ahead. Yes, sorry, Dan. I'm just coming to your comment. I just saw it. So yeah, 50% in 5 years is the kind of figures that I would focus on, and I think it does sound scary because it is a lot. But if you imagine putting in an LED light bulb, for example, will cut your footprint by about 90%. If you go to an electric vehicle from a petrol vehicle, that's a reduction, top of my head, of about kind of 60 to 70% as well. So these are things that are relatively possible and achievable, and it's likely you've already made some reductions already. Just to give another example of a kind of corporate body and what they're doing, Microsoft is a really interesting one where they've set a target of a 55% reduction by 2030. So they're quite ambitious there. They're really attempting to align this. That's compared to a 2019 baseline. So Microsoft have put a line in the sand of going, we are going to compare all of our progress against 2019. And therefore, all suppliers to Microsoft are required to submit plans on how they are going to reduce. And that kind of a requirement is really key in getting people to for their suppliers to submit data to their portal of what their carbon footprint is and what it looks like. And therefore, every year that progress is being monitored. They're also introducing carbon pricing on projects so that any new proposals that are going into Microsoft as a tender are having a kind of pricing mechanism based on the carbon footprint of that company as well. That typically is only for larger projects. So again, I wouldn't expect this to affect any companies on this webinar. But if you are, a 10 million pound company going for a really big contract, that is going to have an impact. Just to speak as well to Diane, just kind of your kind of concerns here of what this looks like in terms of a real reduction. This is typically the journey of a kind of a company in that 2019, their footprint might have been 100 tons. And then during 2020 to 2022, that probably dropped off due to working from home and like less travel just because of COVID. And that's probably increased steadily up to around 2023, where it might have peaked. And then they might have introduced this kind of carbon footprint focus, and that has then reduced year on year. This is equivalent to around an 11% a year reduction. So that 11% is just really finding the areas of your organization where those footprints are quite large and then cutting them down and kind of shaving off the edges is how I like to think of it, to get down to that 55% reduction by 2030. So again, relatively 50% sounds quite big. Hopefully 11% sounds less scary. If you are going for government contracts, then I would recommend the something called PPN 0621. It sounds really technical and scary. It's actually an incredibly simple document that is basically what is your footprint, what are you doing about it, and then it's just a framework that the government has set out. It is aimed at tenders worth more than £5 million, but I still would recommend this if you are submitting any projects to go for this because it is quite a good framework. But it does require that carbon footprint and a reduction plan. I'll come on shortly to define scopes and what that kind of measurement part looks like, but it does require scopes 1 and 2 as well as scopes 3. And in terms of scope 3, it's basically things like business travel, waste, transport distribution, any commuting that you're doing, and any kind of energy that you're using as well. So it's relatively simple, and it sounds technical, but again, it's quite simple. Um, so yeah, baseline year, most recent year, and then your kind of reduction targets and your projects. That's the format of the document. So it's relatively straightforward. One last thing, just to kind of think about supply chains and where this is really aligning and where we're seeing a lot of the pressure coming from is around carbon footprints. We don't see any real pressure coming from government on this, especially at the smaller end of the market. Some big companies are required to measure their footprint, but for anyone who's less than like, I think it's about £36 million in turnover, which is quite big, they don't need to report their footprints. So where we're seeing the pressure really come from is from supply chains. So scope, your emissions are someone else's kind of emissions essentially here. So if you look at someone like Tesco's, they've committed to a science-based targets initiative, and therefore they're needing to measure their supply chain's emissions. So they might turn around to a bread supplier and ask them for their footprint. That bread supplier is then going to turn around to a logistics firm and ask them for their footprint. They're going to turn around to their HR department and go, actually, what footprint are you kind of contributing towards our footprint as a logistics provider? That then goes to their paper supplier. And then it might be that you're sort of 7 steps removed from Tesco's, but actually that knock-on effect is going to come down the supply chain. It's called a chain for a reason. So Alice, you ask, can you just ask your suppliers for their scope 1 and 2 emissions and call that your scope 3 emissions? Your theory is correct in that basically everyone's scope 1 and 2 is someone else's scope 3, but in terms of your reporting of scope 3 at this moment in time, unfortunately not. What you're suggesting, I think, is once everybody is reporting scope 1 and 2, yes, then the entire system fixes itself. At the minute, that scope 3 element is really difficult. Apologies for diving straight into scope language without having defined it. I normally do these slides in a slightly different order, but we'll rectify that shortly. If you look at Tesco's carbon footprint as well, it's a really interesting one to me because, again, I'm a bit of a nerd on this stuff, but kind of about 80, the majority of their footprint is in the things that they buy and sell. So, about 90% of their carbon footprint is just from things that they sell and things that customers are then buying. If you look at their running their stores, actually powering and running the electricity into the fridges and stuff for the stores is only 1.4% of their carbon footprint. So this highlights the challenge of someone like Tesco's to reach net zero because they need to decarbonize by 90% their entire supply chain by 2050. That's the scale of the problem we're facing here. And that's where really, if you have this data, if you have this carbon footprint information, that will put you ahead of the game if someone like Tesco's comes and asks for it. It's unlikely they will do directly, but as mentioned on kind of this slide, it's that someone at some point is going to ask for this data. It's just making sure you've got it to hand. And it is very simple on how to do that. So things are happening. And I think I always like to start with these slides just because it gives a bit of hope that actually there is a lot of this stuff happening behind closed doors. And it's not happening in the public eye. It's not happening in terms of like government policy, but carbon footprint and understanding the kind of the environmental impacts is happening and it's accelerating. So we are going to be seeing more of that pressure and conditionality coming. The hard part is me being able to predict where it's going to hit you or where it's going to come from because it is going to be multiple and indirect. It might be you go for a council grant for a sustainability plan and they ask for your carbon footprint. That's going to depend on the council. It's going to depend on the size of business. It's going to depend on the grant. It's really hard to tell. The main thing is that action on this is going to help you build operational resilience. The lower your carbon footprint, the lower your energy bills are going to be, the lower your costs are going to be in most cases as well. And therefore, that helps you protect against things like the energy costs, which were driven by fossil fuel prices increasing. Apologies, I'm still recovering slightly from a cold from a conference I went to last week. So I'm still getting there. In terms of what a carbon footprint looks like, so just wanted to just define those scopes that I mentioned a few times already. If you look at your scope 1 emissions, this is essentially your direct emissions that your company is responsible for. If you have a gas boiler, if you have a gas hob, or if you've got any vehicles that are owned by the business, these are your scope 1 emissions. Now, I'm not talking about your home usage. If you are working from home and you've got a gas boiler, that is not your scope 1 emissions. I'm purely treating this as if you had like business premises. So if you're renting a garage or a warehouse unit or a shop or something like that, think of your gas boiler and gas hobs being there. It becomes quite difficult to split your home emissions from your business emissions if you are working fully from home. Scope 2 is much easier. It is basically where do you buy your electricity from? So unless you're on like a heating network or a district heating network, which not many people are in the UK, it is essentially where do you buy your electricity from? If it's from an unreliable or reliable source, depends on whether you can count that as a reduction or not. So moving to some renewable energy suppliers can reduce your footprint down, but not always. Scope 3 is where it gets really interesting and much more overwhelming and difficult because it is everything else. It's indirect. So if just looking at this picture of this coffee shop or kind of bar, let's start at the front at the right-hand side where we've got all of the coffee cups. Those coffee cups, where are they being kind of purchased from? Why are there so many of them? Are they single use? Are they recyclable? Are they just for takeaway cups? Why aren't they using refillable ones? That's going to be a carbon footprint. So every pound that they are spending on single-use cups is going to have a carbon footprint to it. From memory, from something, I think it was the eBay Roadshow we did, Anna, kind of several years ago. I did the carbon footprint of a cup like that, and I think it's about 60 grams of carbon emissions for every single disposable cup. So, you know, you're looking at several kilos of carbon just sat there on that counter for disposable cups. To the left of them, you've then got those mugs. Well, actually, are they being used in the dishwasher? They're being reused. Why are there so many single-use cups, and why aren't there more kind of reusable ones? The coffee beans in the hopper there, where are they coming from? That's part of your scope 3 emissions. The electricity that's being used to power the toaster at the back there, I think it's a toaster, or kind of the kettle at least. Where's that electricity coming from? You know, that's your scope 2 emissions. But ultimately, this is a rented premises, and that if the emissions are if the energy bills were in with the rent, it might be that that ends up being a scope 3 because this gets quite confusing. Don't worry about that too much for now, but there are nuances here. We look at the bottle of wine that's sat in the back as well. Is that being recycled? Why is it a bottle of wine? Why isn't it a box of wine, which has got much lower carbon footprint than a bottle? Is the glass being recycled or is it just being put into landfill? All the teas on the shelf behind them, the paper straws. Everything here is about the carbon footprint, right down to the person in the middle of the photo. How did they get here? Did they drive in? Did they fly in? Did they cycle in? Did they walk in? All of those impacts build up that scope 3, which is typically if you start looking at an image like this, which is the more technical one. I don't really like these because they do get very overwhelming, but you can see all the different parts of those scopes. So you've got the scope 1 emissions in the middle, scope 2 to the left, but then you can see that scope 3 is the majority of everything. Transport and distribution, processing of sold products, use of sold products, franchises, investments, business travel, employee commuting, capital goods, so the things that you're buying for the business. These all form part of the footprint of your organization. And that's typically the point that the reaction I get is this, in that it's incredibly overwhelming because you're starting to realize that everything you do as an organization has a carbon footprint. The good news is you are not expected, and it's very unlikely that you will be required to report on all parts of your carbon footprint. So if we look at this image again, in terms of that scope 3, the only bits that I would really encourage you to be considerate of and think about measuring are employee commuting, business travel, waste, and that's probably it to start off with. So those are data sources that you probably already have information for and is quite easy to find if not. So if you do have 5 employees, you can go and ask them, how do you get to work? And then from that, you can start to build out a carbon footprint relatively easily. And we'll look at an example later of how to get that data. If you want to be more ambitious and driven with this, Then purchase goods and services is quite a good one to do. You can just plug your data in to several tools that will then give you an estimated footprint based off of how of your accounts data of where your money's being spent. It's not perfect, but it's quick and easy. Um, but I don't know if even like corporates, I think like Microsoft are probably the only kind of corporate that I know of who are measuring all 15 parts of this carbon footprint. And they're one of the rare kind of good corporates out there. There's plenty of corporates that aren't measuring all of these scope threes. So don't worry, as a small business, you are not expected or required to measure all parts of this. I'm just giving you this as like the full picture so that then you know when you're going forward where those gaps might be and where your knowledge might end. A much simpler way to think about your carbon footprint is in five key areas. So you've got energy and buildings, you've got your transport, you've got water usage, buying and selling, and waste. These five areas make it much easier to visualize and walk through your business and go, actually, where are these different carbon footprints coming from? So energy and buildings, that gas boiler I mentioned, where are you getting electricity from? Transport, how are you getting staff to work? What travel are you doing for events and for various conferences? Water usage, probably not a big part of your carbon footprint, but something to be really aware of because the price of water is going to go up over the next few years, and you want to be aware of that. Buy and sell, again, calculating the footprint of those coffee cups that were on the previous image is really difficult to get an accurate figure of how much the carbon footprint is on single-use coffee cups, depending on what you're buying. However, you do know that you're buying them, and therefore you can look at that and go, well, it's quite likely to infer that something you're throwing away a lot of is going to have a higher footprint than something you're reusing. Therefore, how do we change that? Quantifying that carbon footprint is really difficult, but saying that you've done it is actually really easy. So that's the thing to focus on, is just documenting the changes you've made. And then waste is another one where it's, again, quite hard to quantify potentially. If you're working with a waste management company, it can be the case that they can provide you with reports for this. In terms of home working, I've just seen Caroline put in, I'll put some links to a calculator later. Effectively, if you are entirely working from home, your business footprint is your domestic footprint, and therefore it's really hard to split those out. And it will be a case of reporting on your domestic usage, taking your energy and gas bills, and understanding your transport is going to be the easiest thing to do there. There's a calculator I'll be sharing towards the end that will allow you to kind of get an estimate fairly quickly on that. In terms of the journey, this is where most businesses start to think of net zero or the sort of carbon reduction journey as being. So you start by measuring your footprint, then you start reducing it, and then you offset it. It's a nice, neat, clean, linear process, which never actually works because small businesses are, by their very nature, quite chaotic, and that's not a bad thing. It's a very good thing, but you need to embrace that chaos in order to have impact. So from going to measurement to reduction to offsetting, this is really what I think the journey is going to look like, where you might start measuring something. You might measure your gas bill, for example, and just start there, get an understanding of what it is. Then you might start changing the way that you heat your home, or you might do some like secondary glazing or make some changes there. And you'll start to want to understand what that footprint change is. And by doing that, you'll understand and gain confidence in what measuring your footprint looks like. Then you might go, actually, well, I can't really change my gas heating. I might try and offset this locally. I might try and plant some trees or do some nature restoration in my local community. Therefore, I'll start offsetting that. And then you might start looking at different actions you can take and go, well, actually, maybe I should cycle to work slightly more, or maybe I should um, put in more light bulbs or LEDs. Let's try and quantify the impact that's going to have. And then you'll start to measure the impact of that again. And then you start kind of spinning around in circles, and the journey starts completing itself and accelerates. It's never as neat and linear. Again, just keeping one eye on the chat. Never understood how a smart meter reduces energy usage. So smart meters are great because it really highlights, there you go, you've got an answer. It really highlights where your energy is being spent and be able to adjust and understand where that is. Personally, we've got a smart meter installed, and we discovered that I can't remember what the device was, but we had it might have been like a printer or something. I think it was something that was just plugged in all the time that was idling and drawing a lot of power. We turned that off, and we could just see the electricity drop off. And there's a few times because it's in the hallway, we walk past it, and it gives you a live reading of how much energy you're using. And sometimes, if you have it on that setting, you can see when a device has been left on that it's much higher than it should be. And so if you've got like I remember what it was. We've got a heated clothes dryer, and so that's quite easy because it's silent. it's quite easy to leave that turned on and not realize, but you can see it drawing a little bit more power than normal. And therefore you can start identifying those and ticking it. Yes, smart plugs are one of my favorite things and very good, but we'll come on to smart plugs at another time. Um, if you go to Argos and buy them, they're about 10, 15 quid and they just solve all sorts of problems. How do you measure? So this is really where the kind of the scale is, and this comes back to I can't remember whose your name, sorry, but the question earlier, Alice, about the scope 1 and 2 emissions and scope 3 emissions. This is the challenge we're at in that at the minute most people have not measured their carbon footprint for a business, and there's this kind of magical idea of a footprint being 100% in the future. Well, in reality, that's never going to happen. No business is going to have 100% accuracy on their footprint unless you are Microsoft or Google and you're spending a few $100,000 on this. Where we're at the minute is that sort of general guidance. So the accuracy of your footprint is that you might start coming to a webinar like this and get an understanding of where different parts of your emissions lie. That general guidance is going to help you build a picture. It might be you then start looking at tools that do spend-based measurement, or you might just look at your gas bill and go, actually, we spend about 10 grand a year or through the business on gas. What does that convert to in terms of a carbon footprint? And then you can get some really back of the envelope pictures quite quickly. Activity-based is really the more accurate piece where you might actually take your gas bill and then start measuring the individual footprint of it. Or activity-based is really useful for things like travel and transport, where if you're getting trains, an off-peak journey or a single cheap advance ticket on a train is going to be the same, is going to look like the same cost, or sorry, that's not the right way around. So the carbon footprint of a train journey, as an example, is one of the ones where spend and activity based is a really big difference, because I've got a train from London to Glasgow, and that has sometimes cost me 150 quid. It sometimes cost me 30 quid for the same distance. So under spend based, it's going to identify those two journeys and put very different figures on them, even though the journey is the same. Activity based is a much more accurate way to get that footprint because it's going to identify the distance of travel you're going. The challenge there is it's going to take a lot more time for you to understand the activity and the kind of the scale of the footprint there rather than spend based. Probably a necessary detail. This is the danger of having a webinar where no one can respond. So in terms of your journey, you're always going to go from the left-hand side where there's no measurement all the way through to getting more accurate as time goes on. The key here really is data. In the before you start measuring, you're going to need to have a lot of data. There's free and paid tools out there. So there's a huge array of carbon footprint measurement tools, all of which are good, bad, depending on your industry, depending on your business. Some are more industry specific. The real challenge here is getting the data first. It's the biggest barrier. We do a lot of consultancy work with companies and do a lot of training around the details of how to get a carbon footprint. The biggest barrier we always find is actually getting the data in the first place, because we can't process the data if it doesn't exist and we don't have it. So before you start anything, just start by gathering this up. So getting a gas bill or an electricity bill or anything like that is the first starting point, where it will then have this sort of information on it, where it will say, last month you used 117 kilowatt hours of electricity or kilowatt hours of gas. If you can start compiling that together and getting a kind of spreadsheet, that means that measuring your footprint, your scope 1 and 2 emissions becomes really easy, either if you're doing this at home or if you are doing it as a business. To walk through an example of what that would look like to get your carbon footprint. So just using, this is an energy bill from a few years ago for, I think it's electricity, but I might have used, yes, I have used electricity. So 117 kilowatt hours of electricity, that's for 1 month. I can go onto the government website and get the emissions factor, which unfortunately I do know off the top of my head because I've done this so much. It is around 200 grams or 0.207 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilowatt hour. So I do 117 times 0.207. That gets me 24 kilos of electricity. I can then times that by 12. And so even if I've only got last month's bill, times that by 12, I get around 288 or 300 kilos of carbon dioxide equivalent per year for my electricity bills. That's my scope 2 emissions. So that's done essentially. As soon as I've got that information, that's a ballpark figure. Getting it really accurate. So this is where smart meters do come in, because you can get a much more accurate carbon footprint and you can get more accurate kilowatt hour usage. and you can start doing predictive changes as well. So the benefit of a smart meter is that you can understand your usage on an hourly basis and therefore go, well, actually, what if we changed our behaviors around those hours to adjust it? But in terms of the back of an envelope, I would hazard a guess that even if I looked at my actual usage, it's not going to be more than about 10% out from that figure. So there's a level here of how accurate do you want to be versus how quick do you want to be. And I think sometimes having something done and inaccurate, but in the right ballpark is much more valuable than spending too long and not doing it because it's taking you so long. The information, the main kind of caveat as well is that your footprint is always going to increase. The more data you collect, the more accurate your footprint is going to be, but the more data you're collecting, the more footprint you're going to have as well. So as soon as you've done your gas and electricity bills and you start working on, well, actually those coffee cups that we're throwing away every month, what's the footprint for that? You're going to start measuring that and your footprint is going to go up. You will be filling in those gaps as you go. So I wouldn't worry too much about this. And I think it's very easy to tell a story to say, well, in 1 year, this is what we measured. In the second year, we measured this plus a bit extra, which is why our footprint went up. Perfect. Don't need more information than that. Most businesses are in this position. Don't let perfect be the enemy of done, or whatever the phrase is. A quick kind of example of activity-based measurement on transport. So let's imagine that you're like a builder or you've got a van and you're doing sort of site visits. Well, this is where it does get a little bit more complicated because there's more moving parts to the equation. It's likely that if you do have a premises with employees, commuting is going to be a big chunk of your emissions unless the team are fully remote. So I just want to walk you through what the calculation looks like here. As we saw earlier, PPN 0621, it does require commuting as part of this. So it is a really easy and good place to start in terms of getting some data and getting ahead of the curve of what's required. So there's several bits of information you will require for travel information and for distance. It's going to be how far are you traveling? How often are you traveling? The method, so what are you traveling in? And that's easily done with an internal travel survey, but you're going to need these three bits of data. So method, frequency, and distance. With those three bits of information, we can start to build out what your footprint looks like. I think it's also important if you are doing travel surveys to do aspirational ones. So how do people want to get to work? Because quite often people don't actually want to be sat in traffic in a car. They might actually want to be able to get the bus or get like a cycle in, but there might not be the provision for them to do so. So firstly, step one, find the distance. So let's say it's 10 miles a day or a 5 mile one-way return journey. Then it's a question of how many days a week is that trip made. So that might be 3 days a week. And what vehicle are they using? They might be using like a diesel van. So if you're doing a works van, I'm just thinking here of if you're doing deliveries or if you're doing like a site visit for as an electrician or something. You then want to find the conversion factor. So for like a transit van, it's around 0.31 kilos per mile or 310 grams per mile there. So we've now got all the information we need just based on a few basic questions. So if we are doing that site visit, we're doing 10 miles a day times 3 days a week is 30 miles. Working on site over 10 weeks is around 3,000 miles if the job is taking 10 weeks. Therefore, 3,000 miles times 0.31 kilos is 930 kilos of CO2 equivalent. That's the carbon footprint for commuting or for the business travel. So again, it doesn't take that much information for you to start building up a picture of your carbon footprint once you have the data and once you've got the basic building blocks of what it looks like. Just to give an example of what this would look like for a larger company. So if you've got a business that's got 20 employees who are traveling in 3 days a week, who are doing 10 miles a day, this is a sort of carbon footprint you're looking at over a year, where if you're doing that in a large petrol car, so like a Range Rover or a kind of big SUV, it's around 13 tons of emissions if everybody was driving in a large petrol car. If you move that over to a smaller petrol car, well, that's almost a 50% reduction in the carbon footprint. So going from Range Rovers to Hyundai i10s, I mean, there's probably quite a difficult argument for people who are driving Range Rovers to do that, but that carbon footprint is possible. Going even from a large large petrol car to an electric car, thinking back to that 50% reduction, well, that's like an 80% reduction going from the two there. Ideally, what we want to do is get people out of their Range Rovers and onto e-bikes. E-bikes at 0.2 kilos, 0.2 tons, sorry, per year versus 13 tons per year. So these 50% reductions are possible with technology we have typically the barrier is infrastructure. And I know there's a whole can of worms around electric vehicles and the sort of life cycle emissions. Ideally, we do want people to be replacing cars with public transport and e-bikes, not with more cars, because even electric cars cause traffic. So with measurement, don't panic. We do have templates. There are templates out there. There are formats and tools that are available for you. A lot of the actions to reduce your footprint is going to have co-benefits, are going to make your company more profitable or more resilient as a result. Your emissions are going to build up over time, and it is going to start it's going to be a constantly evolving picture where you're never going to have a perfect fixed picture. And this is why typically you do this carbon footprint historically. So if you're looking at doing a carbon footprint right now, what I would recommend you probably do is go back to 2023 and try and estimate your footprint, because you'll have all the data available for that year. And then in about 3 months' time, you can do it for 2024. That's if you're doing a calendar year. You might want to do this financial year, depending on your business. I'm going to pop a link into the chat that's got it's a carbon estimator that we've built. It's a tool. It's completely free. It will take about 3 minutes. So do this after the webinar, but it will get you a rough footprint of what your carbon emissions look like, even if you are working from home. So this will give you a rough ballpark to go finger in the air. It's probably about 5 tons, 10 tons, or whatever it is. We've designed to be very user friendly. You don't need to gather any data for it. We've made some assumptions in the background so that will do it for you. So I'll pop a link into the chat for that. And then that is it from me. Over to Q&A. I will go through the chat very quickly because I think there are some questions I've seen that I wanted to come back to. So Hillary asks, how do you measure car sharing? Which is a great one. Sorry, Anna. I'm just going to keep going.
Don't worry.
Yeah, so car sharing, I think it's a really interesting one. So a lot of the figures that we get, so that van figure that was 310 grams per mile is for the vehicle. So if you've got 2 people in that van, or you've got 5 people in that van, you can just calculate it accordingly. And, it's 310 grams per mile for the van. Therefore, per passenger, it would be maybe 150 if there's 2 people, 50 grams if there's 6 people, etc.
Are you just going to go for it, Adam? Do you want
Yeah,
mine?
I'm feeling very alive today and this morning.
Go for it.
I'm quite like fired up, so I feel in my element. I'm just sort of
Go for it.
channeling full Alan Partridge energy, I think. Um, so,
It is
so
Friday.
it is that Friday feeling. So someone asked a question about hybrid cars. Where's it gone? Duh, 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 duh. I have a hybrid car. Calculating the petrol figure is fine, but not sure how to calculate the battery part. So the good news, Janice, is that there are figures from the government on hybrid vehicles that take all of this into account for you. A lot of this data is out there. So all you need to do is go onto the UK government website. I've done the same thing again, where I've only sent that to the panelists. Let me
Shaking
find
my head because Adam always does this. He tries to send everyone something in the chat and just sends it to the hosts and panelists. So I'm the only one
just
who can see it.
Anna relentlessly seeing it. So if you find that figure out, if that's the source for a lot of these kind of government emissions figures. But let me just have a quick look. So I've got a spreadsheet saved for passenger vehicles, and for an average hybrid car, you get to see some live footprint work here. This is very exciting for everybody. It is, if it's a plug-in hybrid, it is around 100 grams per mile. Per kilometer, sorry, that's per kilometer. Yeah, so it is kg per mile for hybrid. Someone asked a question. So if you go into the spreadsheet, Janice, there's more details on there. I'm not going to do it now because otherwise I'll just end up live reading a spreadsheet to you.
We can share key links and everything when we send the recording of this, by the way. So if you're worried about missing links or anything, we can just send them straight to you in the replay email. I'll get Adam to send them to me afterwards.
Perfect.
I have
So
a question ready if you want one.
I found one from Caroline earlier from AI that I
We're
lost.
fighting over questions this morning.
Oh, then I'll stop talking and let you take it. About electricity usage, AI usage being, is that scope 2 or scope 3? So scope 2 electricity usage is only the electricity usage that your business kind of consumes. And therefore, if you're paying money for an energy bill, that's your scope 2. If your landlord is paying your energy bill, then it's your scope 3 emissions. It falls out of scope 2 because you're paying somebody else who's then paying the bill. So It's only if you're directly responsible for the energy bill, it's your scope two emissions. Anything else is scope three. So like AI usage, for example, would be scope three. And that's like it's really hard to get the accurate data on that. So this is where I'm saying with a lot of these things, it's about understanding and having an awareness of the decisions you're making rather than getting too caught up in trying to measure everything all the time. I'm also going to put a link into chat for a LinkedIn post that I did this morning around some facts around AI and sustainability. So just as a bit of a link. I'll now be
No, don't be quiet. I've just got a list of questions in the order that I saw them. So I'll go. So Valerie asked, if you already had a low baseline in 2019, i.e. using an EV, solar panels, LED lighting, etc., does this make it much harder to make the 50% reduction by 2030 because the easy wins are not available?
Short answer is yes. And I think this is the challenge as well for small businesses that are starting up is that arguably for Small 99, because we started like 2, 3 years ago, and we obviously always started with a very low environmental footprint in mind. If we were to game the system, we'd buy a coal power plant, run it for a year, and then turn it off, and then boom, and that's like 99% reduction in our carbon footprint. This is sort of the challenge is that a lot of the frameworks out there, it is a guide. It's not necessarily a requirement to do that 50% by 2030 for a small business. And if you've already done those things, great. Tell the story. Because I think it's far more important to tell the story that in 2019 you were using solar panels, electric vehicles, and all of that. That's going to put you ahead of the curve in those requirements than someone who says they're still planning to put in solar panels and electric vehicles. So don't worry too much about the footprint reduction figure because that is aimed more at large companies, but telling the story is really important.
Fab. Keep the questions coming, guys. We've got some time for a Q&A this morning. So if you've got anything burning, please do pop it in the chat or in the Q&A. Somebody was actually, I think Anne was wondering how, she's actually not sure how a smart meter reduces energy use. There were some answers in the chat, but maybe just a quick explanation on how that can help her reduce energy use.
Yes, it's all about behavior change, really. And I think smart meters and smart plugs are a great way to identify and highlight the usage that you're actually creating, because essentially every pound you spend on electricity or gas is a carbon footprint. So you really want to be focusing on identifying where that usage is happening and why it's happening. Because it might be like a smart meter is a great way for our Christmas lights every year. We put them on a smart plug, sorry, so that the smart plug turns on at 4 p.m., turns off at midnight. It means that we know that for the other 16 hours of the day, those lights are not on. That is something that's quite easy to happen if we forget to turn them off, and therefore it's drawing power, and it means we can track the power as well. That's the individual device level with smart plugs. With a smart meter, it helps to identify trends at sort of a building level and go, well, actually, we know that our peak usage is at 10 a.m. And then you go, well, why is that? Is that because everyone's coming into the office and constantly turning the kettle on and reboiling it, and it's causing a massive spike? And actually, if we put in a hot tap that then people could just have hot water on demand, that would reduce our footprint by 50% because that spike no longer happens. So I think that's where smart meters are really key, that it helps you identify challenges. It's not gonna fix it by itself, but it will highlight the behavior and challenges for this.
Wow. Caroline put something, it's not a question, I just made me really smile when I saw it. My partner is a shepherd. My partner is a shepherd and saved 500 miles usage in his 25-year-old diesel guzzling Land Rover during lambing time this year by using his e-bike,
There you
which
go. Perfect.
obsessed.
That's the case study I want to see, because that is
Yeah.
like people always say that these things aren't possible. It's like if they can do it, and lambing across fields on an e-bike sounds it's pretty pretty difficult, I imagine.
Loretta asked, do you have any good tips on calculators for travel? But then you might just pop one in the chat afterwards.
Yeah, I don't know of any for travel specifically. I would probably just do some Googling around because it depends on like the use case. The government figures are there. So if you are find someone who likes spreadsheets is probably my first response here. And then just go and find out even the good travel calculators are going to want you to know how many miles you've done in the vehicles. So that's normally the first hurdle to actually work that out, and that's going to require a bit of spreadsheet work either way. So I'd start there, and then I will put a link into the chat to a free calculator as well, which I would also recommend. That is again, it's a bit more manual, but it is free, which is not many of them are. So
I have another question, or are you
No, no, keep going.
spreadsheet focused?
There we go. No,
Jonathan asked, how do you measure scope 1 and 2 in a co-working space?
you don't is a short answer. So that is where it all becomes your scope three, because technically you are not paying the energy bills. So there's a few ways to do that. Engaging the landlord, aka the co-working space, is a really good starting point, just because it shows that people are thinking about this. If not, if you look at the EPC rating of the building, that will have a carbon dioxide equivalent estimate per square meter of the building. And therefore, if you've got a desk, you can go, well, that's probably 2 square meters, and therefore our footprint is probably that. That's the quickest way to do it. There are other ways you can do it, but it's just not worth you spending too much time on it, I don't think, because you can't change it ultimately.
So I just read a comment from Diane. Adam's enthusiasm is so infectious, makes me want to live in a cave though, with no heating or lighting.
You can do like you do a passive house cave where it's got, heating and lighting, and it'll be really, really eco-friendly and off-grid. You don't have to sacrifice things. We have the
You've looked
technology
into
to.
this, haven't you, Adam?
I have. Like there's a great companies where you can they're called Heb Homes. They do it's not caves, but they do these really beautiful like wooden crofts for Scottish Highlands that are just like huge glass walls. It's all triple glazed, it's all like off-grid heat pump with a solar panel and just these kind of beautiful landscapes. So I don't think there's a real danger with sustainability that it's always seen as this sort of going back to the Stone Age or going back and like giving up on AI and going backwards. But actually we have the technology to make it zero carbon and really, really comfortable. But yeah, it's a whole separate webinar.
We'll do another one on that.
Yeah.
Liv asked, I think you also asked this in the Q&A. I'm calculating our scope 3 this year in the wine industry. Very behind on sustainability. You're not behind, Liv, because you're here. You're doing something. Our suppliers have given us wildly different carbon figures per bottle, and some have said they can't give us a figure at all. When reporting, do we take an average, an estimation, the highest figure, or something else?
Oh, great. I'm so pleased you said this because I'm experimenting at the minute with doing kind of climate change education through wine tastings and doing 6 wines where you talk about the impacts of climate change. And part of that is the carbon footprint of different wine bottles and like packaging. So close to my heart, this. I think it's really challenging. So I know there's like the low carbon bottle standard or the bottle weight accord or something like that that might have information that's sort of industry standard. With suppliers giving you the data, I think it's always going to be different because they might have different methodologies and they might be including different things. And so there's a good carbon footprint and there's a bad carbon footprint in that people might not be taking into account everything. I would look at the Wine Society because they've got sorry for the typing noises, packaging. There's a report they did that might actually have some information in it that you could use or like compare against. So I'm going to check those out. I think it's this one. This is
Ah,
good. This is challenging my that I do have answers for pretty much any question.
Liv,
Pushing it
sorry,
here.
I misunderstood your question, Liv, when you said behind. You're a sustainable vegan winery, everyone else is behind. Got you. I was going to say, if you're measuring and everything, you don't sound too behind.
So yes, exactly, Karen. Any that's mostly why I did it. Is that working in climate change, sometimes you do need a glass of wine. So why not combine the two of them? The wine bottle footprints, it's got some information in that document on the kind of the kilogram per bottle, I think, or the packaging formats. So have a look through that. That might give you a bit of a benchmark to compare against and to, compare to what your suppliers are giving you.
Chloe said, "Tell us who you are, Liv." Yeah, send us the link to the Sea Change Wine. I love Sea Change Wine. um, I just saw a request. Okay, Chloe. I was asked to calculate the way I send my parcels to customers, but I use a shipping platform where I can choose the couriers to use per shipment that's best for the customer. So it's difficult to monitor. Have you any tips?
Um, it's difficult. So I think I'm not sure if I fully understand the question, but I think if I'm interpreting it
I
correctly,
think it's that they can choose different couriers depending on
yeah.
what's best for the customer.
So, like Royal Mail are normally the lowest carbon footprint because it's the way that they deliver, and this is where it gets quite difficult with parcel delivery. So, Royal Mail, they'll drive a van to the end of your street, they'll then get out and carry the letter or parcel to every front door. If you do that with like DHL, DPD, the other ones, they will typically drive a van to your front door, get out, deliver it, get back in the van, start it up and move. So it's higher emissions through some of those unless they're using electric vehicles. So Royal Mail do tend to be the lowest as a rule, but not always. It will depend. It's again one way you have to ask for the carbon footprint from them because it will depend based on the volume of the parcel. Because if you're sending a big, let's say you sent a bottle of wine in a box that was like a case of wine box, but you had one bottle in it, that's going to have a much higher carbon footprint if you sent that via raw mail than if you then sent like a small bottle of wine in like a letterbox bottles that then goes through as a large letter to someone through raw mail. So it's a really complex, well, there's so many moving parts to it. I would engage with your suppliers and ask them for a carbon footprint per cubic meter of packaging, because that will get you the most accurate figure. And that's probably what they're reporting on.
Fab. Alice said, do you have any ideas for how to find emission factors to spend-based Scope 3 calculations? I often find they are behind a paywall on specific tools.
Um, Not really. I think that's the problem with like a lot of the spend-based ones. They are just going to be you're going to have to pay for it. The one that I put into the chat earlier, Clean Growth UK, is a free tool, and that is, but it's not going to find those emissions factors necessarily. It will give you you can start to see it a little bit more because it's free to access. You can then put in some information of like 100 kilos or 100 pounds, sorry, of spend, and it will give you the factor out. It's not going to give you the source for that though. Um, spend-based factors are just such a nightmare because it's going to be depending. It might be proprietary information that they are using, and it's therefore they're not going to give that away for free, or they might be using university data sets, which then is depending on the university, or they might be using the government factors, of which there aren't many, and there's huge gaps in. So the government don't really provide spend-based emission factors. So no is probably the short answer. Sorry, Alice.
Um, Cheyenne asked, oh, she likes the sound of that. Is there a link to the place in Scotland?
Oh yes,
I think we're all going to end up living in one of these sustainability caves, aren't we?
yes. And then yeah, so I'm just gonna put in the chat as well. It's carbon footprint per volume of parcel.
Becca has asked, I'm interested in the calculations for home working, as I'm currently working almost exclusively online from my home service as a service-based business.
So your best bet is there's a tool we put on the website there that will give you a kind of carbon footprint based on home working. It's essentially it's going to be your gas and energy bills essentially. So it's quite difficult to work out more than that if you are working from home. It is your personal footprint. So, because you get down to the point of going, is the sandwich that you ate for lunch work or home based? And you just get, it's just not worth spending the energy and time trying to quantify that. It is more just take kind of a rough, either an assessment for your home gas and energy bills, or for your personal lifestyle in terms of how you're operating, and treat that as your kind of work one.
Fabulous. I think that's all the questions. Diane, you've really been making me chuckle with your with your the hermit life. Here I come. I think we'd all come back, wouldn't we?
Back to the caves, all of us.
She said, I need a laugh just as you need a wine. Yeah, we all need a laugh and a wine sometimes, don't we? Um, any more questions before we head off? I don't think I've missed any. Anything you would add to the before we go, Adam?
I think really it is just don't get too caught up on measurement to a certain extent. Like I think there's diminishing returns where you can really sweat the exact details, and ultimately, if you're worrying about grams or kilos of a carbon footprint, it's just not worth it. That's sort of why we built the measurement tool. It's like the estimator because it was just to move people along as quickly as possible. Because the biggest challenge that we found is that people, if you've got 10 hours to spend on sustainability, people were spending 9 hours of it on trying to measure their footprint and only 1 hour on impact and how to change, which is completely the wrong way around. We need to spend an hour on measurement and getting a rough ballpark figure to go, we think we know this is wrong, but we think this is about it's in the right ballpark. And therefore, here's what we're going to do about it. Here's the 9 hours we're going to spend on getting an e-bike to ride across hills and do lambing season rather than using a diesel car. Like that's the sort of action that we need. That's what we kind of is required, is that level of outside the box thinking and thought and ambition, rather than just trying to set a spreadsheet and work out whether it's 9.4 kilos or 10.4 kilos, because it just doesn't matter.
Frank said, roughly right rather than exactly wrong.
Perfect. Yes, I love that. Exactly. Because I think that's the point, is like with a lot of these estimates, you can put in a caveat to say, here's our thinking, here's the assumptions we've made, here's where we think it's probably going to be roughly incorrect, and then just move on. Like it's too, you spend too much time worrying about details when it isn't going to have that impact on your business. Oh,
Would burn a measurement. Any?
yeah.
Yes, from Caroline.
Okay. I think I don't know exactly if there is wood on the government figures one. It's quite high. I did look into this ages ago for a campsite, but yeah, wood is relatively high, and the danger with wood is the particulate matter. It's the kind of the carbon emissions in the room more so than the actual footprint overall. So it depends how you're using the wood. That's one to, yeah, I would Google into that one because I don't actually have a quick answer.
Loretta wonders if there's any good example of organizations telling their story or journey well.
Hmm.
We do a lot of measurement.
It's a good question. I think sticking with the wine one, I think Ridgeview have got a really good carbon footprint. Is it Ridgeview? No, it might be Night Timber actually. It's one of the English sparkling vineyards. They've got like a really good sustainability policy that tells them of their sort of challenges and their kind of
Chloe
carbon
says,
footprint. So
Chloe says yes, Ridgeview.
yeah,
Concord.
that might be Ridgeview then. So yeah, I'd have a look into those. All to be fair, a lot of the English wine, sparkling wine companies have quite good sustainability records, and they've measured their footprint and they're doing stuff with it. So I dig into them.
Brilliant. I think that wraps up the Q&A, unless there's any final questions. But I think we've covered a lot there and
Yes,
had a lot of fun this morning
I've,
as
I've,
well.
I've enjoyed it. Quite like, I had
Um,
the right energy to come in and just spend an hour shouting at people about carbon footprints. So apologies, everybody.
no, you weren't shouting at all. I think we all learned a lot this morning. And we all know where Adam is going tonight, a cave bar. I think so. I think he's going to go and
Or
have a
is
sea
it?
change wine in the cave bar. Thank you so much for coming this morning. I hope you've all enjoyed it. I hope you've all learned lots from it. We'll be sending out the replay to you on Monday, and I'll make sure we get the links out to you as well of all the resources that Adam used. Hopefully see you all again soon. You know, we're really committed to our sustainability training here at Small Business Britain, so there'll be loads more opportunities to get involved with all our sustainability offerings here. And we love it when you guys turn up for them. So have a lovely weekend. Can't usually say that because we're on a
No.
Friday. Have a lovely weekend, everyone. Hopefully see you soon. And thank you so much, Adam.
Take it easy, everybody.
See
Have a
you
nice weekend.
soon.
Speak to you soon.
See you
Cheers,
soon.
guys. Bye.
Bye, guys.